So in this video, I'm gonna break down the exact process that I've built over the last 7+ years through a lot of trial and error and a lot of lessons learned, so that hopefully by the end of the video, you have a very clear roadmap and it's a very good structure, so that you can skip a lot of the lessons that I had to go through in order to build a body that lasts for decades instead of days. And this all started in my early 20s, where I stopped or had to stop with playing sports because of a knee injury. And then the options in fitness were very simple. You could either run, you could lift weights, or you could do some body weight training. And I tried all three, and each and every one had something I hated. Running just simply bored the shit out of me, and it had a not so good effect on my ankles and my knees. Weightlifting felt or made my body feel extremely robotic and stiff, which I hated. And bodyweight training was much better, but it did rely on doing a lot of volume in order to stimulate growth. So what ended up happening is that, as you can see here, I was not, or at least I was not pleased with my body composition at the time, especially considering the amount of time and energy I put in. I tried multiple angles. I even tried other training pursuits like Athlean X, which promoted this athleticism that I was after. But what ended up happening is that I felt not good, I looked not good, and I even developed some shoulder injuries above or on top of the knee injury that I was still facing. So I had to undergo surgery for my knees, and I was not in the best place. I felt more like a state of survival instead of a state where I could really thrive. But in this pursuit, I luckily found a new training philosophy that I went on exploring, and that was a way where I managed to incorporate working on the gymnastic rings, which I thought I would never do. But what I also thought I would never do is working end ranges of motions or ranges of motions I didn't even know I could control or get into, and the combination of which in which I combined strength and mobility with more dynamic forms of movement was something I couldn't even comprehend. So when I found this training modality, this new philosophy, a lot of things unlocked for me, both from a neurological perspective, but especially from a physiological perspective. And what ended up happening is that I just felt much better, like a lot of the tensions that were present in my body, stiffness that were present in my body, just dissipated, gained a lot more strength. However, last year, as I became a dad, there was something that was a problem that came to the surface of this training modality, and that is that this system where you're trying to expand on flexibility, mobility, dynamic conditioning, working or improving raw strength with the gymnastic rings, is that this system was designed for sub-athletes, people who were willing to invest 6, 8, 12, 15 hours per week into their physicality, which is just simply unsustainable for men with real responsibilities. But inside of this philosophy, there were some foundational elements that I thought, hey, anybody could implement this. And if you implement this, I think a lot of people, and especially the men that I work with, they will gain a level of movement freedom that simply most never experience because they don't know how. So in the last 1.5 years, I started to strip away everything that was not stimulating growth, not giving you the mechanisms that proceed you forward in a way that you could actually implement it. And what I found is that from all the things that I did and all of the sort of growth that I made throughout the years, even though it was with a lot of volume and a lot of hours, there were just two capacities at the root of everything. But that's not what the fitness industry is selling us, because what the fitness industry mostly sells us is output. It's how much you need to train. It's how much muscle groups you need to stimulate. It's the ideal waistline. It's how proficient you are at the different zones where you do cardio. It always is selling you output, 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 output. Do this or you don't get there. Do this, da 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 da. And what ends up happening is, because we're so focused on output geared towards the aesthetics, so geared towards building muscle and geared towards having a cardiovascular system that is just good for decades to come, we never look at the fundamental capacities to improve just simply how we move and how we can become stronger and more resilient in dynamic situations. And therefore, what ends up happening if you only focus on output geared towards aesthetics or cosmetic aesthetics, I would say, is that you often leave a lot of ranges of motion at the level of the joints unchecked, therefore creating discrepancies between the amount of force your skeletal muscle can produce versus the connective tissue that cannot match the force production, or at least has a harder time matching that force production, and can lead towards tendinopathy and other issues at a joint level or at a tissue level. And something which also doesn't rise to the surface in these more traditional modalities is trying to utilize this element of the brain and nervous system where you are increasing or incorporating many districts of the body that are producing force, that are under load, where the brain has to do more calculations, has to summon more coordinative capacity in order to make sure that everything is organized in a good way in relation to space. And this is a big problem, because what I already mentioned is that it creates a lot of discrepancy between what we actually want to do, movement freedom, what we want to achieve movement freedom, versus what we actually have from a structural sense. And what the result there is that the people, or the men at least that I work with, they have pain, they have issues, they feel sensations at the level of the joints, of the tissues, but they don't have a damage issue. They have a capacity issue, which basically means that if you're in a state of discomfort, of pain, etc., or at least chronic pain and a chronic state of inflammation, a chronic state of tension that is not well distributed, is that you simply just lack the capacity to deal with a certain or multiple demands. Most can produce force, but they fail to utilize it at a full range of motion and in a coordinated fashion in relation to space. That is the most, or the biggest problem I see with the people that I help. So what is then the fix? How can we flip the script? Well, as I already revealed a bit, what we want to do is we want to prioritize two capacities that are at the foundation of all of the movements that we can perform. Because if you really, really think about it, if you really look at what sitting is, what lying is, sprinting, hanging, throwing, or even the highest form is playing sports, it's all a combination of expressing ranges of motion of our structure in relation to space. They are all movement expressions of moving your joints in the degrees of freedom, in the ranges of motion that they have, where we produce force over the ranges of motion that we have, and we do it in a coordinated fashion. So the two movement capacities are therefore always that if you have enough strength to meet most demands that we want to place on the bodies over a full range, decreasing the discrepancy between connective tissue, fascia, and also your contractile output from skeletal tissue, and two, being able to coordinate as many areas of the body through space or in relation to space, then everything that happens on top will improve. It's one of the reasons why, for example, I never warm up for sprinting. Like, I just don't. I'm not afraid that I will tear a hamstring. I'm not afraid that I might get injured with, potentially doing something at the level of the hip. Nothing. And that's simply because I just build a lot of strength at a full range, in this case with the Nordic curl, where I'm very sure that, at least from the hamstring perspective, which is very essential for sprinting, it doesn't break. And I also worked many ranges of motions at the level of the hip in end range, so that I can utilize internal and external ranges of motion for, landing, loading, and propelling forward. So these two should be at the forefront of your current developments in order to build a body that lasts for decades. Because again, every movement expression is just a combination of those two elements at the foundation. Now, how I like to do this, so the roadmap, that the process with the modalities that I like to incorporate for these are threefold. So we start with strength. And strength refers to, in my case, is just having or being able to produce a lot of force in sagittal planes, in the sagittal plane of motion, so forwards and backwards movements. And we do this at the levels, at the level of the shoulders and predominantly the lower body, hip and lower, in which we work with two horizontal elements, a horizontal push and pull, and we work with two vertical elements, a vertical push and pull, and we work the front part of the legs, and we work the posterior part, the back part of the legs. So in this case, the most important objective, and this is not only for strength but for all the pillars of those two capacities at play, is that your sole objective is to make sure that you push your maximum threshold of a specific movement pattern forward. The sole objective is not to accumulate time which doesn't stimulate change, which is what a lot of movement modalities following specific rep ranges, because that is output, that is what sort of science says that is the perfect way. But actually what we want to prioritize is looking at it from a physiological perspective. Inputs. When does the body feel the need to adapt to change? And that is when your maximum threshold of a specific movement pattern or modality is being stimulated. So our idea is only go in, or that's what I like to do, I only go in to push the push the max threshold forward. So I go in, I immediately go to my max, and I stay there as long as I can. And then once I'm done, I'm done. I'm done for the rest of the week, because I have stimulated my max, as we will see, through the various ranges of motion in the patterns, and then I'm done. So I have more time left for recovery, for letting the tissues heal and the nervous system also be replenished for the next session, the next week. Now, for the strength pillar, we like to use a concept called the strength curve. And the strength curve basically tells us that we have stronger and weaker parts throughout a range of motion. And a good example here is a bench press. If you bench, you start from the starting point, so you have your shoulders extended, at least maximally, hopefully extended. Then you push, and in this part, so the initial part, which you can often find, is that you can actually push until you're, maybe 30% all the way, and then you often get to a point that you feel stuck. Then you need some assistance, a buddy or something else, in order for you to overcome that sticky point. And then maybe the final 30-20% you can push through all by yourself again. That is basically what the strength curve is. And this shape, it's a different shape for different ranges of motion that you would try to address, but you will always have this part if you're working with more traditional types of strength training, because it would be a complete nightmare. Think about it. If you would, well, first of all, if you try to bench at your max here, and if you can't, push through, you can never utilize the rest of the range of motion that you're trying to build strength in. Now, the nightmare would be, or if you would use weights, the nightmare is that if you want to stimulate every part, pick up, drop weights, put on weights, drop weights. So it would be just an extremely time inefficient way of trying to stimulate your or try to stimulate growth to happen. So that is not so time effective. But bodyweight training there, on the other hand, has the advantage that we can actually utilize the strength curve, because what bodyweight training does is that instead of having weights to increase or decrease load as a way to increase the training variable and make it harder. With bodyweight training, we manipulate, or we try to manipulate, the body position in relation to space. And when you do that, you can manipulate that positioning according to your strength capacity at every inch of the pattern. So for example, if you take a look at this pattern, this is a front lever row in which I'm going basically from a partial shoulder flexion or extension to full extension. I'm pulling, trying to engage the traps. I'm trying to engage some part of the lats, working the posterior muscles. But what you can see here is I'm trying to pull every inch of the pattern at maximum capacity. So because I'm manipulating the body's positioning, where I'm here trying to manipulate predominantly the relationship of the hands and the shoulders, I can look for those sort of sticky points, or the parts where I'm stuck, every inch of the pattern, and try to stay as close to it as possible. And that is the beautiful part. So we flip an entire set on its head with a repetition, seeing the repetition, as I said, and each part has the opportunity to be maximally stimulated, because in this case, what you saw with the front lever row, if I'm increasing the amount of horizontal distance between the hands and the shoulders, I make it harder. And I'm also extending the legs, which puts extra pressure on the shoulder, and I'm now pulling up. But if I want to make it easier, I simply bring the legs in, or I bring the hands more back in line with the shoulders, decreasing the horizontal distance. So with the strength patterns inside of the protocol that I'm running, we always utilize, or try to utilize, the strength curve so that we maximally stimulate each inch of the pattern, and therefore make progress in a very time efficient way, in also leaving a lot more room for recovery to be present, only stimulating that max. Now, for mobility, what we want to do is we want to specifically target the most restricted areas near end ranges. So what I like to do, there are 6 patterns that cover, again, the joints that possess the most degrees of freedom or range of motion that we have. Shoulder, spine, and the hips. Those are the priorities in the mobility pillar. And what I also like to do is, if possible, I like to also, again, try to make sure if we can incorporate working as many districts of the body as well. So in this case, I'm working a hinge, which has a primary focus on making sure that you work the posterior chain, or working the end range of the posterior chain, flexing the hips, therefore engaging the posterior chain once you're in end range of motion. And what we're trying to do here is, rather than moving towards your safe, this should be safe, towards your safe and controllable range, which is here, which you often do with a stretch. So a lot of people stretch, they go towards their safe controllable range, they stretch, and then they back off. But what ends up happening is, if you simply just stretch, you're not really utilizing the physiological mechanism behind it, because stretching is a sensing mechanism. If you stretch, you're basically altering the position of the body, but for the brain and nervous system, you're just simply saying, hey, this is where I am at in space. And the brain and the nervous system is always calculating where you are in relation to space, and if your joints are accessing ranges of motions that it feels comfortable or not being in. And that has all to do with the ability to contract in certain ranges. So if you cannot contract in a range, let's say I would slip and my rear leg would go into hyper hip extension, your brain and nervous system wants to have the ability to pull it back, so that you potentially don't rupture a ligament, or so that you don't harm or create some cartilage damage at your hip socket. So that is something it always wants to have. Now, what you want to do is you want to use the stretch to get into your end range. So you're using a stretch, you do have to stretch, so that you know, hey, this is my max. That's also where you feel areas or tissues being stretched. That is, okay, I'm now in my end range. but then you want to provide a maximal contraction, because again, a contraction is simply the communication pathway we use with the brain to say this is what we can control or not. And as you can see, as I'm pulling myself in this position further and further, because the brain and nervous system allows me to, that is because once I'm here, you can see it here clearly, I am just contracting the areas that are stretched as hard as I can. The harder I can do it, the quicker I build buffers, or I also strengthen connective tissue in that end range, building buffers, making sure that the discrepancy between force production of the muscles and connective tissue decreases, so we can utilize and don't develop injuries in certain positions. And because that contraction happens over time, the brain and nervous system feels safe to give me more range of motion to potentially again build more strength into. And that's how you build resilient joints, strengthening near end range. And in my case, or what I like to do, I like to pick just a couple of patterns, because again, I always want to make sure that I also try to incorporate as many areas of the body as we can, so that we also stimulate coordination. Now, what that does is that versus a traditional approach where you go into end range, you stretch, you back off, you might feel some relief over time. You're simply back at square one. You go in, contract as hard as you can for just a minimal of time, period of time, or you go in, contract, do it for a set per week, minimal time spent, and then for the rest you recover and lean back. Now, finally, I like to also incorporate the spine, where we work the rotational capacity or opposite rotational capacity of the shoulders and hips by side bending the spine. So this has a spinal engine as the premise, which means that if you bend the spine in relation, or when you are locomoting through space, which with the more traditional locomotive patterns like walking, sprinting, running, what tends to happen if you side bend the spine is that there is an upwards rotation, an upwards and forwards rotation of the hip, and a synergistic backwards and downwards rotation of the shoulder. So there's opposite rotation from the spine. And what you can see here is that once you do that proficiently, you automatically bring your head more over your foot when you are moving through space, as you can see here. And the more head over foot you can position yourself into, the more you are better, or the better you are aligned with gravity, so that force gets distributed across the entire structure in the most efficient way possible. And what I like about working the elastic band here is that the more range you try to pull the bed into, the more force you have to produce, because a band always wants to pull back. Just like a rubber band or an elastic property, if you stretch it, it wants to pull back. That's what a band does. And in this case, we do that with spinal bending and creating that opposite direction of the hips and the shoulders. You automatically build strength. You build profound contraction signal towards the brain and nervous system. You're safe. You want to stimulate change. That's what you do with contractions in this rotational fashion. So these pillars make up the two fundamental movement capacities: strength over full range, efficient coordination through space, so that once these are efficiently built, you can sit, squat, run, sprint, throw, without fearing that the system will break. And that's how you build a body that lasts, because the more proficient you are at those two, the more movement freedom you can experience, and the more performance optimization you can utilize with all of the movement expressions that you can see here. Now, what you can see, or what I've seen from myself and the people that I work with, the men that I work with, is that once they utilize these components, they tend to see a lot of improvements and improvements in their force capacity. So at one hand, their skeletal muscle is able to meet much higher demands. They also have force managers that are very resilient. So your connective tissue, your connective tissue, tendons, but also ligaments, they tend to also match, or tendons in this case, they can match the force output from your musculoskeletal system, but also your fascia tends to be much more developed due to the fact that you've got a denser network of having a brain and a nervous system that can fire across multiple areas of the body in a coordinated fashion. So this is why you see a lot of the men that I help improve in all of these domains and unlock various elements or decrease issues that they were dealing with. So for example, with Dennis, you can see on the left, he started out with a chronic issue on his shoulder, especially when bench pressing. And what I saw is that he had various elements or ranges of motion of the shoulder that were very restricted. So we focused on that in combination with building strength at a full range and working some other planes of motion. And in just 3 months, he was able to pull at full ranges, doing pull-ups, which I think he could do 3 pull-ups, and then he could do 8 pull-ups without any pains, any sensations. Or for example, Charlie came in with chronic lower back issues from years of heavy traditional lifting, squatting, deadlifting. But in his case, what was the problem were his hips. So yes, he could produce a lot of force, but his ranges of motion at the level of the hips were just underdeveloped, in which they caused restrictions and were not able to match that force production. After 4 weeks, his lower back issues started to dissolve simply by focusing on the restricted areas. Then for Bob, what we did is we created the plan on 1.5 hours a week by creating just a couple of patterns for mobility, focusing predominantly on the strength patterns and utilizing a nutritional bioenergetic framework, and saw massive improvements in his body composition. Same goes for Matt, seeing massive leaps in his body composition, and after just a couple of months was working on handstands, doing bar muscle ups as a side bonus effect of working just a couple of movement patterns in the strength pillar. Or Jacob, who unlocked his first ever ring muscle up. At the start, he could just do partial dips. Or Gio, who had faced a serious ankle injury, and he was able to unlock a full deep squat after what was for him 20 years ago. So these are just elements or results of men that I work with that simply just focused on a couple of movement patterns that are very scalable, that work on trying to improve that max capacity only forwards, so you don't have to train hours and hours and hours, but just with very precise signaling, 1.5 hours per week, you can achieve massive results. So if you want to achieve something similar, if you are looking to build an athletic, lean, and pain-free body, no matter your capacity, I'm working with people ranging from 67-year-olds all the way to early 30s. If you want to build that strong, athletic, and lean, pain-free body, and truly honing in on the 2 fundamental capacities that help you build a body that lasts for decades, then you can apply in the link below. And if this resonated, hit a subscribe, and for the rest, I'll see you in the next one.